The Lost Signals attended the Mid-Atlantic Popular and American Culture Association's 20th Annual Conference, otherwise known as MAPACA 2017. Jonathan Manczur, Christopher Morgan, Stephen Hermosi, and Scott Thurlow all gave presentations at the conference. So please, enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Manczur. I think he did a fantastic job, and actually our talks really do tie in together because we're going to talk about masculinity as it applies to, and in a way you alluded to, like kind of the mythological cycle and how these archetypes exist, not just like in modern day, in the old days as well, and how they haven't, yes, these messages have updated over time, but the archetypes and the structures still exist. So how many of you have seen Legion before? Okay. And how many of you know a little bit about mythology? Okay. So a lot more know about mythology than Legion. So those who know about mythology understand that there's actually a kind of complex discussion behind what a myth counts as. You can do like the kind of monomyth and the broader scope. You can divide them up into like folk tales and legends, and I'm going to describe it as 3 different aspects to it. The first one you have, these are tales that come from oral tradition. These are tales that, in a sense, have no author. And some traditions of studying myth suggest that like these can only be tales from olden days. If you take if you get rid of that aspect and you say that, well, any story can be like a myth, then I think this has a very specific role, that a myth counts as a work that has grown beyond sole authorship. You have a work that, so if we look at Hercules, for instance, you have all the tales from back then. You have Kevin Sorbo in the Legends of Hercules. You have The Rock with his original, his newer film. And in a way, like the X-Men and comic books have a very similar feel to that. That these are works that have been told by different people, have told the same tales with similar themes, with similar characters, similar plot lines, but each with distinct twists to it. So these are tales that have grown beyond just one sole author, and have grown to be kind of a part of the collective consciousness. The second part I want to talk to is that myths tend to hold on to a kind of mythic framework. And you can look at a number of different authors over time who have studied the structure of myths. I happen to be a big fan of Joseph Campbell, so I am basing my talk off of Joseph Campbell's work, but we'll get back to that. And then the third aspect is that myths tend to be instructive or prescriptive. So instructive goes into, if you look into Prometheus, for instance, if you look at the myth of Prometheus, it discussed how Prometheus stole fire, but he did it with fennel stalks. So this was instructive to the Greek youth over how to transport fire. And you can look through all of these different like aspects of mythology or myths to see that like the instructive elements. And then you have how a society ought to be, which is the prescriptive end. So I'm going to then argue that Legion, I've already suggested that comic books in their structure and being told by different people in different mediums deal with, take out the first part, which is the idea of the removal of sole authorship. I'm then going to discuss how Joseph Campbell actually predicts or matches a lot of what Legion has to say. And then for the third part, I'm going to discuss what Legion has to tell our culture. So, for those who don't know Legion, it's a tale about Charles Xavier, Professor X, who most of you should know through cultural osmosis. Charles Xavier has a son called David Haller. And David is also a telepath. He's a mutant. And he's also telekinetic. The thing is, Charles Xavier gave him up for adoption when he was young. And David Haller grew with his power and not knowing he had it. He was also, just as you mentioned in the complex plots, he has a parasite of a mutant that was an enemy of Professor X living within him. And this makes him think that he's schizophrenic. So he ends up in a mental institution, and where he spends most of his young adult life until the call to adventure comes, and he becomes the hero he was supposed to be. So, in Joseph Campbell's work, it's not part of the traditional cycle, as you'll see it, but it's actually a supplemental part, which is the childhood of the hero. In general myths, they'll have the hero because he's a hero. He has to, from birth, show great powers and kind of show what he will one day become. Oftentimes, this leads to an event that stops him from going immediately to the call of adventure. So, David Haller, the opening scene of Legion is shown throughout his life. Him using his powers, and him, in a sense, going slowly insane, or thinking he's going slowly insane. And he ends up locked away in a mental institution, Clockworks. Now, this is strictly to the point of what Joseph Campbell's saying, where we've seen his powers through birth. He was destined to become a hero, but it was given a instance of self-imposed prison here, and which stops him from achieving the call of adventure until the point he does. Then in Clockworks, he gets the call of adventure. Now, one of the beautiful things about the hero's journey is that, as Campbell describes it, is that they're not one. It doesn't have to follow a strict A, B, C, D. These can be moved around and switched. So 2 events happen at the same time. It's a thing called the Meeting of the Goddess, where he meets a character called Sid Barrett, who, when introduced, she is bathed in light from behind. She has a purity to her, a slow motion. It's the classic goddess archetype, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And it's also his call to adventure. He actually now has something worth living for. And he falls in love. Sid is about to leave. Sid is also a mutant. And their kiss causes she has the power to swap bodies on physical touch. So upon that kiss, they swap bodies. She can't control David's power and causes destruction. And this is leading to that call to adventure, that a situation that creates him having to change his life, him having to change Now, granted, we might not consider an insane asylum a comfortable place to live, but this is his area of comfort. Taking the medication, quieting the voices that he gets from telepathy with medication. This is comfort for him, but now he has a reason to fight beyond that. This is where the introduction of Division 3 comes in. And Division 3 is the shadowy governmental organization. Josh Whedon is also a huge fan of those type of characters. Division 3 is the Threshold Guardian. This is the first conflict that David Haller has to pass between, in a sense, his home, the insane asylum. Again, a weird thing to consider home, but for him it does make sense to cross over into the appropriately titled Summerland, which is the refuge for mutants. And he does get help here. He gets help from his fellow mutants, but this is the Threshold. He goes off to Summerland, and now he's on the road of trials. He's, his sister gets kidnapped by the Division 3. The Shadow King, which is the parasite in his brain, is causing constant conflict with him. It eventually comes up to the point when he rescues his sister, and and everyone culminates at his childhood home, where the big battle between the mutants, David Haller and his friends, and the Shadow King comes up. So now I'm going to talk about the Shadow King and Sid Barrett, the goddess and the temptress, and the duality of how women are portrayed in the comic books. Because Sid Barrett, I can't really speak to whether, I know a lot of my male friends really liked Legion because it spoke to a certain thing I'll talk about a little bit later, about kind of the role of the male in today's world. But I'm interested if, for any women who've seen it, if during the Q&A session they can point out if what they thought about Sid and Lenny portrayal. But so Sid is in a way a twist on the classic goddess. She can't be touched, otherwise she switches consciousnness. That's a huge, like, if you look at all the like Disney films and the classical folk tales, it generally involves a princess locked away in a tower, someone who it requires a lot of effort to break them out of this kind of impenetrable cage, and so that the man can, in a sense, conquer and have his reward. It's not the greatest of all viewpoints, but that's the traditional like myths deal with this. So Sid represents that character pretty well in a modern day. Like, she has sexual experience, but as another person. She's never had it for her own self. Lenny, on the other hand, is a male demon in a woman's body who was actually an interesting fact was Audrey Plaza was the actress who played Lenny. And when originally it was supposed to be cast for a man, but she impressed the director so much that he decided to hire her. And then she said, no, I don't want to change any of the dialogue. I want to have every graphic thing that a man was supposed to say in the situation, I want to say as a woman. So she took on literally a male's role and to become the monster, which is an interesting like kind of dynamic between both as a progressive thing and also a regressive thing. Like, women aren't supposed to say this, but she demanded she say this, and she's a villain for being more masculine. So there's an interesting dynamic there. But both of those play both the classic stereotypes. Excuse me for a moment. Dramatic pauses, you said? Now, the Shadow King locks David in a mental coffin in order to take over his body, the belly of the whale. This is where David has to fight against, he's trapped. There's no way out. And oddly enough, again, the twist of this is they're shifting it around so that the atonement with the father comes at this point as well. In order to beat the villain, David has to come to grips with his father's failures. He doesn't know it's Professor X. We do as the audience, but he doesn't. But he knows that his father failed to defeat the Shadow King. So, in a way, like in myths in general, it's either the father's the tyrant, the father's or the father's such a great being that the son has to learn how to live up to it. A very Freudian influence in Joseph Campbell. But here, it's essentially that the father abandoned and failed to deal with what he needed to do, so the son has to pay for the father's failures. It's also here that the object of this elderly sage bringing the boon to help, a character called Carrie, develops a halo for David to wear, which will help control. And so, again, all the elements of the hero's journey are in the Legion, just swapped around. Okay, so Magic Flight. Finally, they return back to Summerland, having defeated the Shadow King, and who's there? Division 3. But now David, confident in control of his own power, what had controlled him in the beginning, what was a threat in the beginning, he can now, with a snap of his fingers, he made a column out of all of the soldiers who were all just placed kind of trapped. It required no effort to beat the Threshold Guardian now that he has achieved his standing. So that's the plot line, and a couple more minutes. There's a couple of themes that I like to end over. One of the big things that the author of this work wanted to write about was a mental illness and the portrayal of it. And actually, this is a growing theme that you'll see. Tim Burton very much has a theme that he likes to address, which is, you're not crazy, you're unique, you're special. If people think you're crazy, it's that they don't recognize your gifts. This definitely keeps with that theory that medicating people, putting them in state asylums, You don't understand these are special people with special gifts, people who could save the world, and we're just locking them away. And it's pretty, like, what is kind of interesting is he really does go in depth with that in Summerland he gets actual therapy, talking like, trying to work out like issues with your past, versus the Clockworks Insane Asylum where they're just shown to be medicated and stored in there. So there's a lot of discussion about the mental illness angle, and I think that a lot of people who have given a lot of accolades to this show for them trying to accurately assess what it's like to have a mental illness. And they show different types of people with issues. At one point, the Shadow King, he's been lying to David Haller along that he's schizophrenic. He goes back and tries to, as the Temptress, tries to give David Haller a perfect existence, where he's no longer schizophrenic, he just thinks he's bipolar. And the way he acts and the fears he has as a schizophrenic versus the fears he has as a bipolar show that it's just not a broad brush of like crazy people are crazy. It's it's a nuanced and accurate, or attempt at an accurate depiction of what it's like for these things. And this was the major theme. There are a number of other ones, but we're running low on time. I think that another one is the idea of, if you look at the role of adults in this work. So all of the baby boomers in here, you have basically three. You have Oliver and Melanie Bird, who are, Oliver is trapped in the astral plane, still back like for 21 years. He still lives as if it's the 70s. And Melanie Bird, even more tragically, is also trapped in time. She's in the reality, but she holds out a hope that her husband will return. And in a way, like, she is attempting her best to be the leader of the group, but she is all of her decisions are colored by her desire to see her husband again. Again, you have Charles Xavier, only implied, but his failure to defeat his monsters, to take on the job that he was supposed to have, has led directly to the situation. You have a very interesting relationship between this one mutant who has a mutant inside of him, Carrie and Carrie. Now, Carrie doesn't age when she is inside him. So she is a young adult and he's a older man. And it's not a sexual relationship, but there's very much an intimacy there. They're more than brother and sister, they're almost one person. And to have this kind of May-December relationship, which kind of plays out, is fascinating. But Carrie himself, as the adult who should be responsible, often finds himself finds himself distracted by what we would consider petty, like the petty romances of the youth. And so these adults do not, and I think that the important part of this is it's a discussion of millennials who feel that they need to take responsibility for the failures of their parents' generation. When we look at, there's a discussion on war in there, like, why are we fighting your war? There's discussion over, like, the responsibilities. We're dealing with what you fail to deal with. And I think that's why it resonates quite a bit with young adult men who have grown up during the Great Recession, grown up during some millennials have known war their entire lives. And they're asking, like, why are we paying for our parents' sins? And I guess I'll leave it off of that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to our presentations. Editing and engineering by the author of the presentation. Music by Christopher Morgan. For more information about the conference, go to mapaca.net. That's MAPACA.net.